Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for making time for a webinar. I know at this time of year it's busy, and also we're all a little zoomed out. I tried to add some humorous memes throughout to just keep you entertained, so hopefully that's helpful. Want to thank SCCCMA for letting us partner with this, and Harper for joining us as well. Our team's going to introduce ourselves shortly. I did want to also note just that we will happily take some questions throughout. So feel free to just type it in. If I think it's relevant to interrupt one of our speakers and get to that question right away, we'll do that. But if it's something that can wait till the end, we'll try to get to them. Okay, so this topic came from a lot of questions that I've been getting. So I lead the local and regional government division for Synterra, and people have just been asking a lot of like, what do you do first? What's the order of business when you get a phase one? And so we are packing in a lot in this hour. So apologize if it seems overwhelming, but the recording will be helpful. And then just know that you will have our emails afterwards if you have questions. So you want to build a new blank, whether that's a fire station, a park, commercial space, mixed use. There's some key questions that you should ask at the beginning of a project that'll help you not only save money, but also just plan better and get your project off the ground sooner. So let's dive in. If I can advance the slide. Okay, so agenda for today, we're gonna go over some conceptual planning and due diligence. We're gonna talk about phase one ESAs, environmental site assessments, and then design build versus design bid build. And Brad, if you're on the line, we got your email and we will answer your question. We already got a question before the webinar even started. And then we're going to do some facilitated Q&A. I'm going to take an opportunity to ask some specific questions to these gentlemen that have joined today. And then we're going to do audience Q&A. So we are going to leave time for some questions. So yeah, like I said, we'll welcome questions throughout. And then if we don't get to any questions, what we'll do is we'll try to answer them internally and get you answers via email for those of you that participated today. And that will come with the checklist that we promised on the flyer if you were excited about that. So introductions. So like I said, I'm the local and regional government market leader for Synterra. I'm also an environmental planner by trade, and so I bring a planning lens to the science and engineering work we do. I'm passionate about helping erase the black box that science and engineering can sometimes be for those that don't have that background. So that's why I wanted to do today. Dan, you are muted. It wouldn't be a webinar without it.
It's automatic. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without it. So I'm Dan Warwick. I'm the market leader for civil engineering. I'm a professional civil engineer. Concentrate on commercial development, industrial development, public development as well. So work basically through beginning parts of projects all the way through civil design, through construction. My background's in construction, geotechnical engineering, and civil site design.
Ben.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ben Hester. I'm an environmental engineer with Synterra, and I specialize in doing site assessments and brownfields projects, both at the state and federal level. And I'm a licensed environmental engineer, have been doing this work for 27 years now.
I'm Craig Campbell. Yep, thanks. I'm Craig Campbell. I'm an associate DBIA. I've been a project manager for Harper General Contractors for the past 6 years in our environmental systems division, working on water and wastewater infrastructure projects under different project delivery methods, so design, bid, build, and design build, which we'll be talking about today, as well as construction manager at risk.
So some goals for today's meeting. Yeah, and you know, Christmas is coming, so why not? We want to give you an increased awareness for how to strategically approach your next municipal civil project. We'd like to give you a nuanced understanding of the current phase one environmental site assessment regulation. And we're going to give you a checklist to assist you with your next construction project. So I will be sending that with the unanswered questions probably a week or so after this webinar, and Allison can distribute. So that is our goals for today. So we're going to start right off with Dan diving into some concept planning.
All right, so normally when I get involved in a project, it's we've got a client that reaches out to me that says, hey, I've got this project that we want to lay out, and we've got this site that we're looking at. So what do we do first? How do we get going? So we take them going from concept to completion. So we go through conceptual planning and preliminary evaluation of the site project we're looking to do, and then we step into the next phase, which is due diligence. So we get into surveying, Phase I ESAs, geotechnical, wetlands delineations, and a few other services that go along there as well. And then you move into developing plans, which is your civil engineering site plans, architectural plans, structural plans, things like that. Working through plans and permitting, and then getting the project into construction and then to completion. So concept to completion is pretty much it's a very simple 5-step process, right? Now, I mean, there's a lot of different things that go into it. There's each individual phase here has a lot of different components. So you want to go to the next slide? So as we get into the conceptual plan at the very beginning, a client reaches out to us and says, we've got this project, we put it on this site. What are we going to run into here? So, we often run into either, a lot of the great sites are gone. And so you're dealing with what's existing. You're dealing with existing facilities on site. You're dealing with, wetlands issues, floodplain issues, topo issues, things like that. So we initially get into a site, take a look at it, and start to look at those different things that might restrict the site a little bit. Topography. Do you have a lot of steep slopes, things like that? What permanent easements might be there? Do you have a wastewater line that runs through the site that you're not going to be able to build over top of? Power line right of ways, things like that. And all this is done on the front end of a project, and it's done basically by desktop review. You can go out to a site and do a site visit, but it's a little bit of initial work that you get into to really evaluate the site to determine if it works for the type of project that you're looking to do. And it's going to help you throughout the whole project as you can do this in a phase situation so that you can determine if your project works on this site that you're looking at. So what we're trying to do in this initial phase is looking at all these different restrictions that we basically have. And this also includes looking at zoning and local development ordinance to determine setbacks, buffers, and things like that, connectivity to adjacent roadways, and as well as your utilities, your local utilities that are adjacent to the site. How are you connecting to water and wastewater and power and gas and things like that? So what this does is it helps us look at the site and kind of basically say you got a 10-acre site, and now you take all these different things that you have in place, wetlands, floodplains, some steep topography. Now you dwindle that down to say, okay, we've got 8 available acres to develop on and actually build on. So this initial phase helps us dive into that portion of the site to determine how we can lay your facility and all the things that go along with your facility: parking, a loading dock if one's needed, storage area, stormwater, stormwater basin, all those different things of how the site lays out. So we do all this to really determine how the site lays out from a 2D standpoint, but then also from a 3D standpoint. So just looking at a site from up above and saying, okay, the building and loading docks, your stormwater, your parking, everything fits, but what's the site work that goes into it? How much grading, how much is this going to cost to build? So that's the other aspect of what we and consultants like us can help do. We can take a look at the site and determine, all right, how much is this going to cost to build? You've got this huge layout that you've got to do. How much grading is it going to take? How much pavement is it going to take? So you can get a kind of a cost to determine up front, all right, this is what we're looking at. So, a site might fit, but if it takes 1 million cubic yards to grade the site out, then financially it doesn't work. So you're not only looking at it from a physical feasibility of it, does it fit, but financially a feasibility of does the site work. So you kind of get through this initial phase and determine, okay, this site layout works. We have connectivity to our roadways. We have our infrastructure connections. The site work costs seem to be in order and what we can do. So what's our next step once we do this? And also in this phase, let me step back just a little bit. In this phase, you're looking for what we call site killers. Is there anything here that we've determined in this desktop review that really just keeps you from doing your type of development that you want to do? And once you determine that, okay, no, we've gotten through that, we didn't run into any of those here, let's go into due diligence. So we go into our next slide. So in due diligence, you get into quite a few different services that's going to help you understand the site a little bit more. And one of the first, so in due diligence, you get into survey, you get into phase I environmental site assessments, you get into geotechnical engineering, you do some subsurface borings. You also wetland delineations, if you have wetlands on the site that you need to identify. There's also a threatened and endangered species survey that's sometimes done, as well as a cultural resources and historical survey that's sometimes done. But one of the first ones that you get into is the Phase I ESA. And on the Phase I, basically you're trying to determine what environmental issues you have there. And that's what Ben's going to kind of jump into and dive into the details of the Phase I.
Okay, yeah, Phase I environmental site assessment. This is for a lot of folks, it's kind of a check the box exercise, or at least there's that view of it. However, I want to give you some kind of nuanced detail here that hopefully will be helpful to you. There's a lot of different scenarios in which properties have this done. The first thing I want to talk about is pricing, and I talk about pricing specifically because I've been in numerous situations over the years where our clients have had 3 or more firms bidding against one another, and it forces the pricing to get real competitive. And that's good if you're the one paying the fee, I understand. However, keep in mind that if you drive the price down on one of these assessments too low, then that forces firms like ours, where we're actually in business to make money. And anybody that provides these types of studies or assessments, the tendency, if you drive the price down too low, is that you end up with someone who's going out to do your site assessment who probably doesn't have as much experience. And so that is a net result when you drive a price down on one of these, is you get somebody going out to a site. Now, if your site's a church at the top of a hill, or a piece of land that's never been developed and it's up at the top of a hill and everything around it is farmland and has been for 100 years, it's probably a very low risk site, and that's fine. But if your site is downtown and has a history of gas stations and is a very complex site, then you may want to consider trying to make sure that you have more experienced folks, not only doing your site assessment, but also writing your report. It's certainly more critical and more complicated sites like the one in the picture here. This was one we did recently where the site had a couple of these above ground storage tanks on it. And this dispenser, we were concerned about this, but luckily we got to interview the site owner, and he was able to inform us that in fact this dispenser had never functioned and they'd never put fuel in this tank, and we didn't see any evidence of that. So that was good. So that's all I'll say about pricing. On context, really it's important to provide as much background to the folks writing your environmental site assessment as possible relative to the transaction, assuming that you're acquiring property or selling property or refinancing property, whatever that may be. The more context you can give the folks writing the environmental site assessment up front, the better a report they're going to be able to write for you. And that context is always important when you're doing interviews and you're doing all the things that have to be done. And then when we talk about limiting liability, I'm going to talk about that here in a couple of slides. We're going to talk about the South Carolina Brownfields program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with to some degree, but we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. Let's go ahead and go to our next slide, Catherine. Okay, so here's a great site with a bunch of barrels on it, right? Can't be any environmental problems there. So your basic environmental site assessment consists of a historical data review, and we get those from commercial data report companies. We're going to go out and conduct interviews, and we are going to conduct interviews not only with our client, but also with the folks who are generally the ones selling the property or who have been managing the property, so we can get as much long-term information about the usage of the site as possible. Then we're going to do a site visit. If there's buildings on the property, then we're going to do a walkthrough of all the buildings. Like to see every piece of every building, crawl spaces, basements, anything we can set eyes on, we want to set eyes on it. We're going to take lots and lots of pictures. But in the basic part of a Phase I environmental site assessment under the ASTM standard, that, the main thing you're out there to do is to identify what's called a recognized environmental condition as defined by an ASTM standard, and that's the standard number of the current version. There is going to be a new version of this standard coming out next year, I believe. And there may be some changes to it. We're about to find out about that here in the very near future. But so we want to identify if there are items that are recognized environmental conditions. Now, typically what we're not going to do is, this is not a level of effort where you're going to go out and do sampling unless your client asks you to do what are considered to be non-scope items. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, Catherine. Well, we'll talk about non-scopes actually the next one after. Let's go, here's the South Carolina DHEC Brownfields program. And in the South Carolina Brownfields program, they have what is called a voluntary cleanup contract. And it's just that, it is voluntary. If you're going to enter into one of these agreements with South Carolina DHEC, it is specifically called the non-responsible party version. So in other words, this is typically somebody who's buying a property, and whatever has happened on that site before, the current buyer is not responsible for it. In other words, they didn't do the thing that caused whatever kind of spill or release may have happened out there. So a non-responsible party, that's a good thing. And the cleanup contract, basically DHEC is going to specify how you do your Phase I environmental site assessment, and then they're also going to specify to you, because generally these sites have a history of contamination, so they will also specify to you the next step after a Phase I, which is to go out and collect samples in a Phase II assessment. Typically we're going to collect samples of soil and groundwater, and some of the ways that you resolve the liability associated with contamination is that it's possible you could put deed restrictions on the property going forward to basically prevent the use of groundwater for drinking, assuming it has some degree of contamination. If you've got soil that has some degree of contamination, then typically you put in place a soil management plan, and you may have to cap the soil. Frequently that's done just by installing parking lots. If you're going to redevelop a site and install parking lots, and buildings, that's going to take care of most of your problems associated with soil exposure. And then you just have to have a soil management plan that addresses any kind of soil disturbance you do in the future for landscaping work or future maintenance work or anything like that. So, and then if you have groundwater contamination, South Carolina DHEC Brownfields folks are specifically interested in taking a look to determine whether or not there's a possibility of vapor hazards coming up from the groundwater, because the volatile organics that you have typically spilled associated with fuel or dry cleaning or whatever, those chemicals are going to want to exist in a vapor phase, and they can come up beneath a slab and beneath a building and potentially present a hazard to the residents of those buildings going forward. So that's something that they're specifically interested in. At the end of the process, under the voluntary cleanup contract, if you do the assessment and you establish protective measures, possibly through deed restrictions or management plans, then you will get from DHEC a certificate of completion. And as the new owner of the property, that's a beautiful thing. That means they're not going to come after you for future cleanup work, because you have addressed the issues that are out there in a manner that they're happy with as you went through the voluntary cleanup contract. All right, so I mentioned a minute ago non-scope issues. So when we do Phase I environmental site assessments, sometimes our clients will ask us to go ahead and sample for asbestos and lead, paint, and sometimes mold. So a quick comment on asbestos inspection. If you are going to do any form of renovation or demolition for a property that you're acquiring, or maybe you're acquiring it and you're going to sell it to a developer and the developer is going to do it, there's going to have to be an asbestos inspection. And it doesn't matter when that building was built. The Federal Clean Air Act says that you have to have an asbestos inspection in order to do renovation or demolition. It could have been built 5 years ago, it could have been built 30 years ago, it doesn't matter. And let's see, Catherine, let's do the next. Yeah, lead-based paint regulations. If you've got buildings on the property that were constructed before 1978, then all the federal lead-based paint regulations are going to apply to the work that's done. Again, when you get into renovation and/or demolition, and especially if those structures are specifically residential or they have some child-occupied function to them, a daycare center or whatever it might be. And then when we talk about mold, mold's a different animal. Asbestos and lead have very specific regulations that tell you exactly what you've got to do. Mold is not regulated at the federal level, and it's not regulated at the state level in South Carolina. And so really, if you're addressing mold, it's really a pure risk management issue. It's definitely something that you need to look at, and you may have to consider doing some form of abatement if you've got structures that have got significant water damage and mold growth. It is definitely a liability issue. It's not driven by regulation. It's driven by the risk. It's driven by civil liability, not regulatory liability. So that is my portion of site assessments. Thank you.
And so and to kind of step back a little bit again, once you get into the due diligence phase, again, if time is on your side, time and money are always the two most important things in regards to projects and going through these phases. But if you've got time on your side, when you go through the due diligence phase, you can set that up. Instead of getting under contract to do all these due diligence phases at one time, you can do them in phases. So you can start off with the phase one, determine if you have any environmental issues, then probably jump into the geotech to determine if you have any issues on the geotechnical side, then into the survey, wetlands, things like that. So, and some of them all this can be done concurrently. If time is not on your side, all these can be done basically within a short, anywhere from 3 to 6 week period, you can get all these services completed. But again, if you're jumping into a site that you know has a lot of known issues, you can do it step by step to try to mitigate some of your costs. So if you get into a phase one, instead of having all these other services under contract and you're getting those done too, and something comes up on the phase one that basically stops the project, on that site, then you're just into for what you have on the phase one. But if you have all the other things already contracted out, then you have all that other work that's going on as well. So but going into the other due diligence services, so one of the next ones that can get done is surveying. So when it comes to surveying, there's a couple different types of boundary surveys that can be done. There's the ALTA survey, and then kind of your basic boundary surveys. Topographic surveys is always done. As-built and private utility locate are two that are normally done when you have existing structures and existing things on site. If you have, say if you're doing an expansion or you have a building that's being demoed, things like that, and you're dealing with a site that's been previously developed, you're going to want to have the as-built and the private utility locates done, one, to determine exactly where those structures, easements, and things like that are on site, as well as the private utility locate. You're going to want to know where those private utilities are on your site, so that, if it's a fiber line or some type of, old gas line that wasn't recorded, things like that, so that you're able to identify those and work around them. We'll do rerouting, things like that. So when you're dealing with existing sites that have been developed for quite a few years, you're going to run into those types of things. In regards to the boundary survey, ALTA survey is just kind of like the Cadillac of surveying. It dives into a lot of title research and title insurance items, and then you can have a basic boundary survey. That comes into play more often than not when you have a green site, something that hasn't been developed on that often. The topographic survey, which of all these is probably the more expensive portion of the surveying. But the reason it is because, you've got to have boots on the ground. They go out there and it takes a little bit of time, but that topo survey is used to put together the civil site design. So when you're looking at stormwater rerouting, erosion control, grading, things like that, some of the big cost items on a project, the topographic survey is needed to help develop those civil site plans. Next slide. So one of the other ones that you get into is geotechnical subsurface exploration. I started my career in engineering and geotechnical engineering. So, one of the things that you get into is how many borings do we need for this type of layout? So if you have consultants in the geotechnical side that you've worked with before, they're familiar with all these items. You're looking at your layout, how big your building is, any auxiliary structures that you have, parking lots, things like that. They can determine how many borings you need to have and approximately what depth those borings need to be taken to to determine what type of subsurface soils that you have. So some of the items that you're looking for when you're getting this type of feedback, and some of the things that can really stop a project or have a big cost effect on a project when you get into these, is shallow rock or shallow PWR, which is partially weathered rock, which is a breakable or rippable rock, but it takes a lot more time. It's a lot more costly on equipment to work with it. Also, you're looking at shallow groundwater. If you're having deeper excavations for foundations or utilities and things like that, and you've got shallow groundwater that's seeping in. These are things that the geotechnical firms are looking for on these sites, as well as highly plastic soils. Are we getting into those are highly plastic clays and things like that? Those can be worked around. These are all things that you just want to have a grasp beforehand, before you get into design, before you get into construction. Because in design, you can work around them or work with them. And then when you get into construction, you know that they're there and you're prepared for them, and you kind of have that cost already built in. When you're working with somebody like Harper with Creed, they can take that into consideration beforehand and understand what's coming up and deal with that then, instead of having in the middle of a project, you run into some highly plastic soils and you got to do lime stabilization or something like that. That can get costly pretty quick. So on the geotechnical side, that's some of the things they're looking for. And then next slide, the other remaining services that you can do in due diligence, if you have existing wetlands on site, in a situation with wetlands, if they're on site and they're on a portion of the site that you're not going to be working on, your development or your project is going to be on the other side, you want to go out and identify them just to make sure that they don't seep into other areas on the site, and that way you can stay away from them. So you come out, flag them, you do what we call a wetland determination. Come out on site, determine that they're there, flag them, map them, and then in the design, you stay completely away from them, and the same thing in construction. Now, if you've got to have a roadway crossing or you've got to have some type of impact on those wetlands, then you'll have to go a little bit deeper and do a wetlands determination, which is a little bit deeper dive. It takes an application to Army Corps of Engineers, so you have to go through that application process. Takes a little bit of time. It can take 2 to 3 months to get through that before you can impact them. And like if you have to have a roadway crossing or put a culvert in or something like that. So those are things to be taken into consideration because it helps you get an idea of your timeline and any additional cost. These aren't huge cost items, but when it comes to if you're having to impact wetlands and more than what's allowed, and you have to go through that process takes a while and can be more costly. So again, it just gives you more information up front. And the other two items I'll hit on really quick. We don't encounter these all the time. These are more on green sites that haven't been developed before. Threatened and endangered species survey, where they're going out looking for threatened and endangered wildlife and plant life. Cultural historical survey, basically looking for any historical relevant items on site that might affect potentially grave sites or things like that. Historical buildings or something that might be found on site, something that has some historical and cultural relevance that would prevent you from being able to develop on that site or on a portion of that site. And if it's a portion of the site, you can kind of rope it off and just stay away from that end of it. So, but that pretty much takes you through the due diligence service and gets you into, once you get through due diligence, the next step is planning and permitting. So you start working through the civil engineer, the architect, the structural engineer, mechanical engineer. They're working through putting together all these plans. And this is a time, and Creed will kind of get into this in the different types of construction you get into a design build, where a general contractor can also come in. And this, I've seen a big benefit on this side of things, where a contractor and the design team is all sitting down together working through this from the beginning when you start to get into the actual design, and you can work through issues beforehand. The other option is you basically, all these plans get put together, you go through permitting, and then it goes out to contractors for bid, and then the contractors are basically just having to build what's shown. And you deal with a few more change orders in that regard, because you're always, the contractor's just dealing with what's on the plans instead of working with the different design team to get that get the plans through permitting and fruition. So, but once you get through planning and permitting, then you get into construction, and that's where Creed's going to take off and go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. Some good points there. So now that we've discussed kind of the initial legwork and due diligence piece of starting a new project, let's look at some project delivery methods for civil projects. We're specifically going to talk about design build and comparing it to design bid build. We'll also look at some things to consider on when to pull in a general contractor when you're looking at building a new civil project. So when to involve a GC? The quick answer is as soon as you can. You know, this does depend on, the amount of involvement does depend on the type of project delivery method. So we're going to talk more about that here in a bit. But even so, general contractors can provide constructability input and review, you know, to help owners and design partners during project development. There's always different ways to put work in place, different means and methods and alternative materials of construction that can be more efficient and save money, which is obviously very beneficial during design development. And then the big takeaway here is, you know, the GC is a key stakeholder in the project. So a big part of the project success is having successful construction phase. So why not include, you know, your builder as soon as possible for that early project buy-in. So what value can you expect to gain when you have a GC involved early in a project? If you're real early in identifying the problem or need on a project, you know, a contractor can help owners and design partners with feasibility studies, which are really just rough order of magnitude cost estimates based on past project experience, historical data, market information. But the nice thing about them is they're usually able to be done with limited information and design and can be turned around fairly quickly. We've talked about constructability review already, but this is probably one of the biggest value adds to having a GC involved early. A contractor, you know, can offer insight suggestions during the design development phase to increase construction efficiencies, which can obviously help keep costs down. And then value engineering. You know, this one's pretty popular with different project delivery methods. But, you know, GC can really add value by sharing ideas from past projects related to materials of construction, building technologies, engaging in trade partners for ideas. Really just helps the owner and design team keep costs down while still maintaining, you know, the functional performance requirements for the project. And then lastly, you know, identifying project risks early and figuring out ways to mitigate them is a big value add with having a GC involved early. It's tied closely to constructability review, but identifying risk and analyzing prior to, you know, having boots on the ground can reduce risks not only related to costs but also safety. So from a safety perspective, you know, analyzing risky aspects of a job, whether it be deep excavations, you may have rock blasting, traffic control, you know, that's stuff that needs to be done and discussed during design development. If it's not analyzed and discussed and included, you know, in the project as a top priority for all stakeholders, by the time you have people on the job working, that is, you know, that risk for safety issues is much higher and harder to control than it really should be. And then from a cost standpoint, same idea as managing risk related to safety, but it's much cheaper to discuss and plan for how to approach and mitigate risk as a team during the design process than having the discussion during construction. We all know time is money. So if, you know, work has to be stopped to look into a better way to approach a risky aspect of the project, you know, the clock's ticking, schedule's being delayed, and that's ultimately a cost impact to the project, which none of us want. So now we're going to look at some basics, you know, related to the project delivery methods for design build and design bid build. From a high level standpoint, this graphic here shows the contractual relationship between, you know, project teams for each delivery method. For design build, the owner has a single contract with the design builder. The design builder can be a contractor or a design firm. It's typically a contractor since the design builder is responsible for construction and design. And the construction piece, you know, carries some heavy insurance requirements. So it's usually a GC since they already have that coverage. And then the design builder then has a contract with the design partner for design services. And then key point to remember here is the design builder is a single point of responsibility for design documents, procurement, and purchasing, and as well as construction fulfillment. And then if you compare that to the design bid build process, has a setup where the owner has a contract with a contractor and a separate contract with the design team. The designer is brought on first and typically selected based on qualifications. They get the project to 100% design and help the owner solicit bids for the construction phase of the project. So design bid build, what is it? Some key aspects, design bid build, it's linear and sequential in process. The owner solicits RFQ and RFP for design services. Contracts with the design team, plans and specs are developed to 100%, and then they solicit for bid. Contractors then submit pricing, and typically the low price contractor is selected. As far as procurement approach, the design partner is typically selected off of qualifications and a fee structure. The contractor is selected on low price. It is encouraged, just keep this in mind, to shortlist prospective bidders if possible. So you don't get a price from a contractor who's not qualified to be bidding on that work. You can end up with a inaccurate low number, which happens, and it's not good. So you want to avoid that by trying to shortlist even in a design bid build situation. And then lastly, in this project delivery method, a GC doesn't really have any involvement until 100% plans and specs have been developed. And that leads us to some positive and negatives related to design bid build. So some pros of design build. It's established project delivery method that it's tried and true, and it's worked well on many projects over the years. It tends to work well on simple projects where you have less risk, where schedule may not be as big of a driver for success criteria. And it follows many public sector procurement laws because in most instances it's low bid objective selection. So it takes out the subjectivity related to qualification based selection. You can go to the next slide, Catherine. So some cons of design bid build. It's linear in sequence to get to construction, so no real opportunity for fast tracking a project through various design packages. There's also not really any added value by bringing the contractor to the table early. They're not there for the design process. And then typically it's a low bid selection for choosing the contractor. I consider this a con just because it's not best value selection. You're not selecting on qualifications and price. As I mentioned previously though, do try and shortlist on design bid build projects if possible. And you can do that through referencing and licensing requirements and some high level qualifications that contractors can submit as part of their bid. So now we're going to look at design build and some specifics related to its methodology. In design build, the owner contracts with one entity for both design and construction. The contractor and designer have a direct contractual relationship, and the design builder is selected on best value. Typically, it's a short list of potential proposers is developed through a request for qualifications and RFQ process. And then the final selection is based on technical approach and pricing during the RFP process. This is what would be considered the best value selection. You're looking at price and approach and qualifications. During the RFQ and RFP process, the design builder typically submits with a design partner, so they're presented as a team for that interview process. Last thing, Catherine, if you can back up one slide. I'm just going to mention one other thing just related to something that's kind of unique about design build. It does offer various contract approaches. So you can have a lump sum GMP, cost plus GMP. And then you also have target pricing, which is really just where the budget's identified early, and it's usually due to funding source. And then, you know, the design and pricing effort through design and GMP development is targeted towards getting the best value while remaining within budget. So, thanks, Catherine. You can go to the next one. All right, so some pros of design build. Big one here, a single point of responsibility on a project, which allows the owner one point of contact for accountability for both design, procurement, and construction services. It's best value selection. So the contractor is not only selected on price and fee structure, but also has some selection criteria based on technical approach and qualification. Owner gets the best bang for their buck with getting a GC involved from day one by adding value early, like we discussed earlier. And then fast tracking a project is a possibility with this delivery method as well. The owner, design partner, contractor, they can work together to develop design packages that, you know, that allow construction to begin prior to a complete design being developed for the entire project. And then contract flexibility. The owner can decide what kind of contract setup they want through different GMP models, but they also can establish some incentive programs with shared contingency, schedule incentives. So if a design builder finishes early, then they are awarded some type of bonus at the end of the project. So some cons, it's fairly new project delivery method in certain markets and regions. So there may be some procurement law limitations. You're not awarding on lowest cost. So that can throw a flag up for related to some procurement law limitations. There's also a lack of understanding within the industry for how the process works and, you know, the best practices related to the design build process. So if you know, basically you can end up with poor team selection just based on inexperience. So that's kind of a pitfall of design build right now, at least. So next steps, we've talked about both delivery methods. I'm going to speak really to the next steps related to design build, since it is a little bit different of a process. So the first thing is you need to identify your problem or need, and then you complete those front-end tasks that Ben and Dan discussed earlier in order to engage, you know, with the potential design builders to take you through the RFQ and RFP processes. From there, you move into the RFQ process, which will develop your short list. And then you move to an RFP process where you're requesting technical approach proposals from each prospective design builder. And then you're also looking at any pricing or fee structures that you would like to take under consideration for selection. And then you're moving into the selection process. So you're considering, you're selecting based on qualifications, price, and technical approach. And then finally, you move into the contract phase, which you started on design. So for design build, you can start with preliminary services or pre-con contract, the initial legwork involving design and GMP development. And after that, you move to a construction contract with a GMP based on final design. And the other option is to enter into a full design build contract where the GMP is established after contract award. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Catherine. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you, all three of you, for all that information. Right now I have the slide up with our emails, but we'll also supply those later if you don't have a pen handy. One of the big take-homes that I think I heard resounding from all three is that the more consultants know about the big picture, the better we can assist. So don't be afraid to call your consultants, even just to ask them some general feasibility questions, basis of cost stuff, anything that can help expedite your project going forward. So I'm going to ask one facilitator question before I get to Brad Cuddle's question from Greenwood County. And then feel free, as I'm talking, to open up that chat and start asking some questions. We will love to answer those throughout. So first question I have is, like I said, it's the common theme is cost savings can come when you inform us ahead of time. So could all of you maybe speak to, and maybe I'll start with Dan, just like how we can, how a GC or an engineering firm can help before the RFQ and RFP goes out? Like what's some of the work that we can do initially if you have the time? And I know you've hit on some of them, but like what are like probably the top 2 things you think that we can help with?
Yeah, I mean, initially, it's really just having a consultant that you know that you work with, or somebody that you can rely on to take a look at that site and give you some initial feedback on that site and different concerns that come up. Even if you don't get into a deep dive feasibility study, which again, even these, just to give people an idea on these feasibility studies, I'm not talking about tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, you can get into probably some deep dives on those, but most of these feasibility studies are probably under $5,000 to $10,000. But you can have a consultant that you know and work with do some work that doesn't take much time at all to really just look at topography, look at potential wetlands, look at easements and things like that to get an idea of, well, wait, you've got something here that's really going to prohibit you doing exactly what you want to do. And then, you know, but if you need a little bit deeper dive and you need an idea of cost and what things are going to, you know, potentially cost for a project like this, you know, consulting along with working with a general contractor that they can give you some pretty good upfront numbers and ideas of what you're going to run into on those sites.
I would also, with Dan talked about site killers, but there's also site assets. So from like a planning perspective, you know, if you don't take note of, you know, heritage trees that are on a property that maybe are worth keeping, like if you can realign where a building's going to be, or if you know you're going to want some sort of, you know, trail around the building that you're building that maybe goes around some sort of stormwater feature, creating it as an asset rather than, you know, some ugly eyesore. That's another reason to really bring a consultant on early, because we can ask you some of those questions and help you think through, so that when you do decide where fire station, you know, is going to go, for example, you know, okay, this is where I need to get the geotechnical borings from, rather than just having this like pie in the sky, oh, we want a fire station on this property, but we don't know where. Like if we can be thinking about not only the site killers, but the site assets, we can help you narrow that scope, which then saves you money in the long term. Creed, did you have something to add?
No, I think Dan did a good job of, you know, talking about from a general contractor standpoint, you know, our especially our commercial team, you know, they do a lot of feasibility studies with, you know, potential developers or, you know, owners that we've worked with in the past. They may be considering looking at, you know, developing a site, and they just want to know, hey, you know, what, you know, based on this square footage, what can we expect to pay, you know, for construction for a building of this type, you know? So we can do that stuff pretty quickly based on some just some, you know, small details. So yeah, I think the feasibility component, and then constructability input as well, especially if, you know, an owner's working with a consultant, you know, that consultant can always, you know, just feel free to pick up the phone, or the owner pick up the phone, and just, you know, if there's a quick question, we're more than happy to help. And I would say that goes for most general contractors out there who are especially working in, you know, alternative delivery type projects. They're pretty used to that. So.
And then Ben, I kicked the same question to you, and I also want to ask, what do you think about, first of all, touch on lab timings and how that can affect price, but then also if you could talk about the future use and what your game plan is with the property. So if are you trying to sell it, or are you just doing this for another property owner as a municipality, especially with like asbestos work?
Right. Well, lab timing, I mean, in other words, if you come into a situation and you've got a short due diligence window and you've got some samples that you know you want to take that are outside the scope of a normal phase one, the faster you want that stuff turned around, the more it's going to cost. I mean, and it can, it's not again, not a significant amount of money, but it is something to take into consideration. And then there's limitations as to how fast laboratories can do certain types of analyses. But if we're talking about asbestos and lead, typically you can still get things done within a few days and or weeks. So it's definitely something that can be dealt with. And then your second question had to do with what's the future use of the property. And that, you know, there's a whole bunch of different scenarios out there that we've dealt with in going into doing due diligence and doing phase ones, and it depending on who's going to own the property, what kind of development is going to be done, how long they're planning to hold the property. I mean, we always ask questions associated with risk tolerance. If we have an opportunity early on in the process, I mean, there's some cities and counties that have been down this path with South Carolina brownfields many times, and they know exactly what that process consists of. But then there's other folks who've never done it before, and so there's a lot of uncertainty. And so you want to get in and ask questions early so that we can explain the process. We can also do things short of an environmental site assessment. If you have a lot of historical reports, we could do a desktop review of those and tell you what the most likely scenario is. That desktop review may include discussions with DHEC, without telling them. We don't necessarily have to tell them where the site is or who the parties are, but we can have a discussion and say, here's a scenario and how do you think this is going to go forward? Or if it's already in the brownfields program, we can go find out how far along are they close to completion, and can that be handed off to the next person who buys the property? And the typical answer is yes, those things can be transferred once those certificates are complete. But one of the most important things with the brownfields, if you know you've got a site that's got some history in it, you know it's likely to have environmental impacts or contamination, you have to apply for that voluntary cleanup contract before you go buy that property. Once you've bought it, you can't enter into the brownfields program. It has to be in advance of taking title on the property.
That is so key. I've interacted with so many people this year that have purchased property without getting that phase one, and now they are a responsible party in the eyes of DHEC. So that's a really good tip. So I have two questions from the audience, so we're going to move on to those real quick. And keep typing them in, and hopefully we should be able to get to these two, and then others we might have to email. Okay, so one quick question we got from Brad Cuddle is that he knows that a new gym project he might be working on can be design build. But what does design build look like for reworking baseball fields, maybe fence, lighting, concrete sidewalks, new football, soccer fields with restrooms and concession? Can any of you talk to that?
Reed, go ahead.
So I guess the question is, you've got a project that is on an existing facility maybe that is going to be design build, or what that would look like. Is that right, Catherine?
Yes, that's what it sounds like.
Okay. So yeah, it would look pretty similar to even a new facility. Really what the level of involvement would be is you would start out with, developing an RFQ for different design builders to advertise. You would basically advertise that for requesting qualifications. And then you could have them engaged with a preliminary site walk, since it is an existing facility. But really after that, it would be the same thing. You'd shortlist based on their qualifications, and really where that site visit for looking at the existing facility would come into play is once you move past that qualifications step, you're going to go to request for proposals, and that's them being able to go out there and look at that existing facility and develop a technical approach to solve whatever issue or whatever y'all are wanting to do. That would be where you would get that information during the proposal process. And then one thing, to keep in mind as an owner working in, you know, in a design build project is you want your, you know, your specification development to be based on performance requirements. You can have prescriptive specs in a design build project, but as the owner, you're really wanting your design builder and the design builder who's partnered with a design engineer to really develop those prescriptive specs. And then what you're holding them to is a performance requirement. So, you know, that design builder, you're paying them to basically develop those prescriptive items that, you know, the project's going to be, is going to have to basically be furnished with. But at the end of the day, you're from a performance and functionality piece of what that project's going to end up at. So that would be my, I guess, answer to help with a existing facility type project.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I think he covered it well. You know, when you're doing a brand new build or you're building onto something existing, design build works basically either way. You're putting the design team and the contractor together at the beginning of the project to work through the issues of the design and to work it out as they go through, so there's less surprise during construction.
So the last question that we have right now from the audience is if one of you could speak to construction manager at risk, pros and cons, and we have 1 minute.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Construction manager at risk, it's, I would say some pros is you're still getting the GC involved fairly early. You're not getting them as involved as you would in a design build environment. So the way that it would look is the owner would hire a design consultant. They would get it to say 30% design, and then that's whenever you would request qualifications and proposals from contractors. And then your contract is with the contractor, and then you have a contract with your design consultant. So you're still getting that early involvement with the GC, which is good value. I would say that the con would be the risk transfer looks more similar to a hard bid or design bid build project. You know, the good thing about design build is, you know, related to risk, you know, there's that single point of responsibility with having a design builder. You're not having to deal with risk transfer related to having a contract with an engineer as well as a contract with a contractor. So, you know, in the design build world, you have less opportunity for change orders, but, you know, that would probably be the one con I would see with CMARs. It's just a little bit different related to risk transfer.
And it's probably worth noting that it really depends on the type of project. So sometimes, like an environmental project, you know, the design build versus design bid build, like for a stream restoration, for example, the pros and cons are a little bit different. So make sure you're asking those questions up front if it's not a civil project, it's an environmental project. Just wanted to specify that little nuance. I do think I saw one more question come through, but I do think we are at time. Let me see. Oh, someone said thanks. You're welcome, Brian. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Y'all are awesome. Thanks for listening for an hour. I know these are getting exhausting, so appreciate your attention. If you have any questions and did not get one of our emails, please feel free to email Allison and she'll forward those questions to us. For those of you that attended today, we will get you a checklist which kind of summarizes some of the thoughts we said today. Just remember, we're here for you. The reason why we're in business is we care about what we're doing. We're really passionate and we want to help you with your next project. And so even if you don't even know all the answers to the questions, we can help you think about the questions you should be asking when you engage in your next civil municipal project. So thanks SCCCMA. Allison, thanks for letting us present today. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, y'all. We appreciate it.